Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the second part of the Sardegna regional course. Today we are covering the Secondo and dessert. So while the first section that we covered was more antipasti and first courses, we're diving into the second part of the meal and the relative pairings that I have suggested for you. So today we're looking at two grapes that, in terms of how they relate to other Italian grapes, in terms of white wine grapes, they're much more typical, they have a bigger sense of identity than most. In that Vernaccia was already being mentioned, written about, bought and sold and consumed in the early 1300s. But this is Tuscan Vernaccia, so it's a slightly different clone. We're still talking about the same type of grape, but it was a slightly different version of it. So when you talk about grapes and their different clones, so for example, Pinot Noir and Pinot Grigio and Pinot Blanc, we're still talking about the same grape, so it's still the same family, but these mutations, if you like, have developed into their own varietals. But the base of the grape, so the genetic base of the grape, is still the same. So there are characteristics that link back to it. So if you want to think about it as a family, then you can. So Vernaccia is something that had been planted now, we think, since the Roman times, or at least a version of it. So it was well present in the mainland very early on in the medieval period. And it may be that the Vernaccia that we find in Sardinia was actually autochthonous from there. So at some point in time, these grapes entered the island through one way or another, colonized the area, and then multiplied to the point where they became a different varietal. This is also possible. The way that I explained Vernaccia as being a really Italian grape, or a grape that has a lot of identity, it's because the wines that derive from these grapes are very specific in that they're hard to like, let's put it that way. And it is also something that we have in Italy, you don't really find anywhere else. Vernaccia doesn't grow in the same way anywhere else. And the one from Oristano, which happens to be on the western coast of Sardegna, is grown in an area which is very, very flat. There are no hills, so it's odd that a white wine does so well in an area such as this. There is a constant, almost near constant wind coming in from the west. It's very hot, very flat. There is an incredible amount of light, which, putting all of these factors together, doesn't make for a promising white wine. White wines need freshness, they need minerality, they need elevation. So what develops is a wine that is, I don't want to call it a baked wine or a cooked wine, because this has a negative connotation, but it does develop flavors which are already tertiary. So they're not fruit and flowers, but rather jam, dried fruits, maybe a little bit of wood, even though these wines hardly ever do any wood. It's almost as if it was an acceleration of aging. So there is a larger amount of heat applied to the grapes, both during growth and during production and aging and stocking and bottling, to the point that these wines develop fast. Vernaccia also has a sweet version, which I have not chosen for the dessert. I have chosen a separate one. However, be aware that there is a sweet version of Vernaccia, and it's made using a floor. So it's made using a yeast base that re-ferments and seals the wine from the air. So you also have the production of this incredibly complex, sweet wine that in Oristano they end up pairing with bottarga, which is it's a dry fish roe sack. So it's they are extracted from the fish, which are they're then dried, salted, and then dried, and it's something that you tend to grate over pasta. So said like that, it sounds a bit extreme, maybe, but the flavor is very complex because it's like almost like an essence of seawater and fish, and it's a little bit like an oyster but less fresh. It's a little bit more aged, and the sweet Vernaccia goes incredibly well with that because being so salty and sharp and it has a little bit of acidity, the sweet wine ends up going really well with it. So going back to our pairing, the chicken made with, it's baked in with citrus notes, it's baked in with things like fennel, white wine, olives, all things which are herbaceous, briny. They have a lot of complexity to them. So you need to be able to choose a white wine. A red wine in this case could also have worked, but in Sardegna they don't make light red wines that are suitable for this kind of pairing. So you need a complex white wine with the same family or the same amount of notes in the glass that you're going to find in the plate. So if I'm going to find herbaceous notes, then I might want to pair that in with something that is a little bit more complex and it has maybe slightly drier fruit flavors, because it just goes in to rebalance that. Because otherwise what happens is that either the dish or the glass disappears. And this is not the idea when you do a pairing. When you do a pairing, you should always try and rebalance it. So the overly potent aspects of the dish need to be rebalanced by the wine and vice versa. So if by the time that you have taken a bite of the food and you have taken a sip from your glass and your palate has rebalanced, zeroed out, it's ready to take another bite, take another sip, then you can consider that the pairing has succeeded. That is not to say that there is a right or wrong way to do pairings, but generally this is the philosophy behind a well done pairing. So Vernaccia has notes of almond in it too. It's a beautiful wine. When I said it was hard to like, it's because we are used to, as a collective drinking people, we're used to white wines being dry and acidic, a little bit fruity maybe sometimes, red wines being dry alcoholic, sometimes a little bit more sugary. So these are just flavors that we're not used to. And because Italy has such a varied climate, we have islands, we have mountains, we have near desert, we have wet swampland, we have everything. We end up creating wines that are incredibly diverse one from the other. So we need to broaden our palates as well. It's something that you might not like the first time. You just need to give it a little bit of time, and maybe it will reveal itself to be an interesting pairing and an interesting flavor that you may not have liked before. I don't know how many times I've heard people say, I don't like anchovies normally, but since I've been in Italy, I've eaten them because they're not as fishy, because the Mediterranean is a closed sea, the salt concentration is lower, and so our fish in general is a lot sweeter. All of the bream, mullet, sea bass, all of these fishes are very mild. They don't taste a lot like, say, Atlantic cod, for example. So we also need to leave prejudices behind, and I do the same thing, so I'm saying this as much to you as I am to myself. So moving on to the dessert, this is a very interesting dessert. The olive oil component is present in a lot of regions in Italy. The lack of butter due to temperature was always, I think it put the brakes on the development of a real pastry culture, unless you're looking at the north, for example. So regions like Piemonte, like Lombardy, where there is a bigger presence of butter, you also have a bigger development of pastry. But I think it's a beautiful substitute to use olive oil instead. The flavor that comes out, generally, if I were to express it in just easy words, I would say it always tastes healthier to me. A dessert baked with things like polenta as well, it's a much lighter flour. It's not as heavy. It's not as decadent. It's almost like the dessert is another course in the meal without it being something indulgent that you have at the very end. The blood orange is great. These are all elements that come together. These are all notes that really tie very, very, very nicely together in a characteristic, very unique way, as opposed to the usual kind of chocolate, sweet, jam, cream world. The wine that I've chosen for this pairing is a Malvasia di Bosa. Bosa is a tiny, tiny, tiny fishing town, always on the still on the western coast of Sardegna, and it is a tiny, tiny production. The Malvasia is a grape that probably arrived into Italy. It's another ancient, older grape that arrived into Italy from the Peloponnese, from Malvasia. So it has older origins than Vernaccia still. And it has been planted all over the country. We have black Malvasia, white Malvasia. We also have Malvasia di Sardegna, which is what goes in to make the Malvasia di Bosa, which is the one I'm recommending. It's a straw wine in that the grapes are picked, dried on either straw mats or cases to the point where they are shriveled, dried. This is not a Vinsanto. It wasn't pressed during Holy Week. It's usually pressed around December, January time. But during that entire time, from picking, which is early September, mid-September, to the moment in which these grapes are pressed, they're exposed to sea air. These winemakers leave the doors open of the wineries and they're all facing the water. So you end up having this big, briny marine influx, which helps also dry the grapes. Sea air is more, has a bigger capacity to dry out than normal air because of the salt component, and the brine travels. So it's just like when you're on a boat or on a ship, the air that you breathe is brinier, which is also why it used to be a prescription in the 1800s: take the sea air, because the iodine rebalances your thyroid, and so on and so on and so on. So these grapes are then pressed and they yield very, very little, very, very balanced, sweet wine. It's not more or less sugary than others, but the flavors, because of the acceleration that I was telling you about before, this is another step into it, because the grapes have also been dried prior to pressing. So there's an additional step, there's an additional process which these grapes undergo to make them even further from a fresh, fruity, sweet wine. Therefore, I don't want to say it's like a whiskey or a cognac, but it's very, very close, because the amount of sugar that these grapes develop is high. Because they render most of that sugar into alcohol, you can be looking at ABVs which go from between 16% to 18%. So it's really quite high. So you cannot pair things like cream chocolate with this. You have to pair things that are what we call pasticceria secca, which is dry pastry, that is biscuits, things with almonds or dried fruits in it, or desserts like the one that you're making. So things that have the same sophisticated, if you want to say, notes as the wine. So it's not uncommon to find notes of leather, notes of furniture polish, these very odd smells that first time you smell it, you think there's something wrong with this wine because it can't smell like that. Wine doesn't smell like that. But that's part of the beauty of it, is that there's so many different types of wines. They have so many different expressions, and there's as many recipes to go with them. So it's just I always think it's a lot of fun finding the right pairing and looking into these things and diving as deep into a region as is possible and trying lots of different flavors, exposing your palate to lots of different flavors. And in Italy we can do that. So it's always a big journey of discovery, and not to mention all of the people behind the production of these wines. Sardinia is not an easy place to grow wine. Often there is an entire company will be based around wine only, which is something that in Tuscany they have abandoned because it's very dangerous. If a crop goes badly, you are at a loss. You make no profit that year. So it's not a hospitable place, it's not a profitable place, I would say, either, to make wine, but the identity is very strong. Sardinia has a very strong regional identity, and so that translates also into the wines, and the food it's very different, and the flavors are very different. The way that these people approach these wines is maybe with more pride and more sense of belonging than other places, let's say. So I hope you managed to find these wines or something similar. As ever, when you do make it to Italy, if you do decide to come, please get in touch. I'll be happy to tell you where to find these wines. It's a little bit tough for me to find these wines as well, but there are places that have them. And I hope you enjoy your cooking. This concludes the Sardegna series. So hopefully I'll see you again for another regional series. In the meantime, any questions, please feel free to get in touch. And happy cooking. Ciao.